So one of the things that I try to ask myself when I read an editorial, an argumentative piece of writing, especially something about a public policy matter, is there was obviously a motivation to write it on the part of the author or authors, and they were motivated because they saw a problem. So I have to ask myself, is there really a problem? Are there a lot of guys like this, or women like this, men and women in prisons who are elderly and sick? Well, there are some. That guy looks like one. Um, and there is this sort of startling claim here that prison inmates age more rapidly than the general public. So they start to have health problems and are called here infirmities at an earlier age. Um, the problem is this problem is overwhelming the prison's ability to manage it, is the claim here. Is it really a problem? One of the things that I would say supports that is that there have been studies on it. ACLU is obviously a liberal uh, organization, so it has an agenda, but it's a respectable, it's a liberal organization, long-standing one, and I have some knowledge of it. So I would listen to what the ACLU had to say with some, with some trust, although I'd have to. But the ACLU thought it was worth looking into. Also, a Justice Department study was made on the matter. So that really lends a lot of credibility to the notion that there is a problem that needs to be addressed in the first place. So I think that that's good. So then, if we sort of accept, at least provisionally, we would want to maybe read those studies to do a more thorough examination of the matter. But once we accept that there is a problem, that there are large amounts of sick, elderly, infirm patient or prisoners in federal and state prisons, then we look at the claim, or the overall claim here, the overall conclusion that prisons should adopt a common sense approach policy of releasing older inmates who present no danger to the public, that we should sort of restate it here, that we should grant early release to sick elderly inmates with families who want to care for them. I think would be important to put in the conclusion that that common sense thing would mean that you wouldn't just sort of release somebody who had all sorts of medical needs out without a support structure. But if that is the overall claim, then we can look at the specific reasons given in support of it. A quick one is that it would be the humane thing to do. And what's interesting is that it's not further discussed, I think, in the in the editorial. It seems to be a strong claim or a strong reason to support the overall conclusion that it would be humane. Do prisoners like this really suffer in prison? Would it be humane to release them? Is it a matter of just common decency, the kind of pity we have for our fellow human beings, that men like this simply don't belong in prisons? They belong in places where they can be taken care of better. That would seem to be a strong supporting reason for the overall claim. It's just barely mentioned here, and maybe it only needs to be barely mentioned, and maybe that's why this picture is here, to support that in a certain sense, although it's not an official part of the argument. I would like to see maybe a little bit more on how keeping elderly, infirm prisoners is inhumane. Their suffering, let's say, the ways in which they suffer, although I guess that's easily imagined. But the other reason, the distinct reason, is that it makes good policy sense, that it's a practical thing to do. And really what that means is money, I guess. That is that it costs a lot of money to take care of a sick prisoner, and more than it would take to take care of a healthy prisoner. And That is, costs will grow as prisons are forced to hire more people, make the infrastructure improvements to make life possible for these prisoners in prisons. That seems to me to be pretty good reason, or pretty well supported reason. Um, the other half of that public policy thing, besides the money, is that the claim in another supporting reason for that intermediate conclusion is that elderly prisoners are far less likely to commit more crimes when they leave prison. And that is supported by statistics from that study, or one of the studies mentioned, I guess, the New York study. The study, okay, in New York, the study found, so that must be a reference to the ACLU study of 2012. Again, those things are put out there, and to really investigate the truth of them, we would have to read the study, check it, look and see if there's any controversy over its factuality, whatever. This study here by the Department of Justice. So, do those two supporting reasons, one of which is argued for pretty extensively, one of which is not, that it would be the humane thing to do and that it would make good public policy sense, do they actually support this overall claim here that we should make the kind of changes in prison and in legislatures and laws that would make possible early release, which really doesn't happen apparently in very great numbers now, compassionate release of elderly infirm patients? Does it support that overall? Do those reasons support that overall claim? Well, the humane thing appeals to our intuitive sense that it's just wrong to keep guys like this in prison, or it's inhumane. The public policy thing is actually fairly well argued for, I would say, that it would save a lot of money and that there would be very low risk involved of these prisoners released to committing further crimes and harming the public. I would say that that's a pretty good argument. That is the overall conclusion here, or here. Is fairly well argued for. But my immediate question about it is, well, what did these guys do? I mean, if we're talking about prisoners who, just my personal opinion, if we're talking about a marijuana dealer who got a life sentence and now he's sick and old, and, probably I might, let's let him out of prison. If we're talking about a murderer, a rapist, somebody who committed some sort of horrible, violent crime, then I wonder, even if he's old and sick, no difference is made, no distinction is made here between prisoners who have committed, say, property crimes or financial crimes or nonviolent crimes, and prisoners who have committed violent crimes. Should there be different rules? I would wonder, what if we have somebody who's committed a murder who is now old and sick and probably no threat to commit further crimes and costs a lot of money? Maybe one of the considerations that would need to be brought in is justice, that even though is very little chance he would commit a further crime, and even though it's very expensive to keep him in prison, maybe justice demands that he be kept in prison, that he be continued to be punished by taking away his freedom. That is just a consideration I would think is, it makes me think, why do we have people in prisons in the first place? Is it for purely practical reasons, that is, to keep them from harming the public any further, or is it for reasons of justice, a sense of punishing them? So I would say that there's a pretty good argument here, but it leaves an important consideration out, which would make me qualify that judgment.